Right now, there are roughly a billion cows on this planet. Billions more chickens get raised and slaughtered every single year. Pigs, sheep, goats, rabbits, entire industries, entire economies built around animals that spend their lives quietly eating grass and grain. Now try to name the last restaurant you walked into that had lion on the menu, or wolf, or hawk. You can't, because it basically doesn't exist. Humans have eaten nearly every plant-eating animal on Earth at some point in history. Predators, almost never. Not as a habit, not as an industry, not as a staple food anywhere on the planet at scale. And here's the part that should actually stop you for a second. Cultures that never met each other, never traded with each other, never shared a single word of language, all landed on the exact same rule anyway. Eat the grazer, leave the hunter alone. A wolf and a cow are both just muscle, fat, and protein sitting on a skeleton. So why did almost every civilization on Earth quietly agree to eat one and not the other? The answer isn't one clean explanation. It's several separate systems: biology, chemistry, danger, and belief, all pointing the exact same direction at once, like they were coordinating even though they weren't. Let's start with the one that's just math. In 1942, an ecologist named Raymond Lindemann put a number on something farmers and hunters had felt in their bones for thousands of years without ever writing it down. Energy doesn't survive the climb up a food chain. At every level, roughly 90% of it just disappears, burned as body heat, spent chasing food, lost to digestion nobody sees. Only about 10% actually makes it to the next step. So picture 100 pounds of grass. That grows maybe 10 pounds of deer. That deer supports about 1 pound of wolf. 1 pound of predator costs you 10 pounds of prey, and that 10 pounds of prey cost you 100 pounds of plants underneath it. A carnivore is, by definition, the most expensive meat you could possibly produce, because you're not just feeding an animal, you're feeding an animal that has to eat an entire other farm's worth of animals first. No civilization in human history has ever had that kind of energy surplus lying around to waste on a single food source. The math simply says no before culture even gets a vote. But cost was never the scariest part of this equation. Something else builds up quietly inside predator meat, and it has nothing to do with money. It's called biomagnification. And once you understand it, you understand why doctors still tell pregnant women to skip shark and swordfish. A small fish absorbs a trace of mercury from the water around it. A bigger fish eats hundreds of those small fish and absorbs all of it at once. Something at the very top of that chain has spent its entire life quietly collecting everyone else's poison, one meal at a time. This isn't theoretical. In the 1950s, a chemical plant in Minamata, Japan, dumped mercury-laced wastewater into the bay, and the fish absorbed it, and the people who ate those fish for years developed a neurological disease so severe it now carries the town's own name. Thousands of people were poisoned by eating exactly the kind of animal sitting near the top of a food chain. The same silent buildup nearly wiped out the bald eagle in the 20th century. Debt ran off farmland into rivers, into algae, into fish, into the eagles that ate the fish, until American eagle eggshells got so thin they collapsed under the weight of their own mothers. Fewer than 1,000 nesting pairs were left in the continental United States before the chemical was finally banned. That's what a lifetime spent at the top of a food chain quietly does to living tissue. Arctic communities learned a version of this lesson centuries before anyone had a name for it. Sled dogs across the Arctic have known through pure instinct for generations never to touch polar bear liver. In 1911, members of Douglas Mawson's Antarctic expedition weren't so lucky. Desperate and starving, they ate husky liver anyway, and within days they were peeling skin, splitting headaches, organ failure setting in. The cause turned out to be an almost unbelievable concentration of vitamin A, stored specifically in the livers of Arctic predators, potent enough that a single meal can kill a human being outright. Indigenous Arctic peoples had already worked this out through generations of trial and painful error, long before a laboratory ever explained why. Then there's what predator meat is actually made of, before poison or parasites ever enter the picture. Prey animals mostly graze, calm, unhurried, marbled with fat. Predators sprint, stalk, and fight for every meal they get. And that constant stress floods their muscle with cortisol and adrenaline, draining exactly the fat and glycogen that makes meat tender. What's left is lean, tough, and often carries a sharp, musky edge from testosterone-linked compounds sitting deep in the tissue. Hunters who've actually eaten mountain lion or wolf tend to describe it the same way every single time. Survivable, not enjoyable. Add in the fact that predators specifically target the sick, the old, and the weakest animals in any population, and you've built a diet that concentrates parasites on top of everything else. Trichinosis, a genuinely dangerous parasitic infection, has been tracked specifically to undercooked bear, wild boar, and other carnivorous game for exactly this reason. A predator isn't just eating flesh, it's inheriting every disease that flesh was already carrying. And even setting aside taste and toxins entirely, there's a much simpler simpler problem nobody mentions enough. Hunting a predator can get you killed. A deer runs. A wolf pack turns around and fights back. Across most of human history, the safest calories were always the ones that couldn't bite back. And that alone would have quietly nudged early humans toward easier, less dangerous prey long before anyone wrote down a single rule about it. The rule isn't absolute, and the exceptions are worth pausing on, because they don't break the pattern, they confirm it. Bear meat shows up occasionally across parts of Scandinavia and North America, almost always cooked until any parasite risk is gone. Alligator meat is eaten fairly casually in parts of Brazil and the American South, lean and pale, and by most accounts closer in taste to chicken than to anything gamey, which might be exactly why it slipped past the usual aversion. Lion meat has appeared occasionally in parts of Africa, but almost exclusively during famine, when every safer option had already run out. In case after case, throughout recorded history, predator meat shows up only once everything else on the menu is gone. That's not an exception disproving the rule. That's the rule holding, even under pressure. Somewhere along the way, belief caught up with biology and made the whole thing official. Leviticus explicitly bans eating birds of prey and clawed animals, naming eagles and hawks directly. Islamic dietary law draws almost the identical line, ruling out any animal that hunts with fangs or talons. Civilizations with no shared history, no shared trade routes, no way of ever comparing notes, kept drawing the exact same boundary on their own. Some anthropologists think this runs deeper than hygiene. You don't easily eat the animal your tribe fears, respects, or worships. The lion, the eagle, the wolf, the bear, these weren't just dangerous animals across dozens of unrelated cultures. They were carved onto shields, painted on cave walls, stitched into the mythology of kingship itself. And in a strange twist that stuck around into the modern world, two of the most commonly kept household pets on the planet, dogs and cats, are themselves carnivores. Millions of households that would never dream of eating either one. Not out of biology, not out of danger, purely because affection got there first and closed the door behind it. There's a newer piece of research worth folding in here, because it points at something almost identical happening with a completely different taboo. Scientists studying why cultures nearly everywhere rejected cannibalism, even in situations where eating the dead would have provided real, badly needed calories, found that the disgust wasn't arbitrary at all. Groups that tolerated eating their own dead paid for it later in disease outbreaks that groups with a strict taboo simply avoided. The researchers behind that work described taboo as a kind of evolutionary safeguard, a rule that looks irrational on the surface, but is actually a culture's memory of a danger it doesn't need to re-explain every generation. Predator meat may have earned the exact same kind of inherited caution. Nobody needed to run a controlled study on mercury or vitamin A poisoning centuries ago. They just needed to watch what happened to the one group that tried it and remember. So the real answer was never a single tight effect. It's a stack, the energy math doesn't work, the toxins concentrate, the meat tastes worse and carries more disease, hunting it is more dangerous than hunting anything underneath it, and on top of every practical reason. We spent thousands of years quietly turning the animals at the top of the food chain into gods, guardians, and pets instead of meals. Every ecosystem on Earth runs on the same brutal accounting, energy shrinking at every single step upward. And humans didn't invent that rule. We just kept bumping into it in every culture, on every continent, until it became so obvious nobody had to say it out loud anymore. The wolf was never going to end up on your plate. The math decided that long before culture ever got around to writing it down.